Kevin?
Hello, can you all hear me and see me? Okay. I'm going to take that as yes. Hi.
Yep.
So welcome to this sort of COVID special edition Artivist Network webinar, even though that's not the most fun word. Let's think about this as an online training so that we must remember we're not just in quarantine. I'm calling from Catalonia, where we've on week 6 of quarantine, but we're not just in quarantine, we're also organizing and using this time to upskill and better prepare for when we get out so that we can have as much impact as possible. So I've been trying to figure out a way to both share my screen and be visible, but I'm not totally sure I've succeeded in that. But let me try at least. Y'all can see my screen, right? Thumbs up or something? Yeah?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay, cool. Cool, so, whoa. Cool, so I'm gonna try to do this so you can see me as well as the screen, but not 100% sure it's gonna work perfectly. But there we go. Cool, so as Amlin said, we're the Artivist Network, and this is called Demand the Impossible. It's our first online artivism workshop. And really, thanks for joining. I'm going to start just with a little bit of the context of what is the state we're in right now and why is artivism important. When we talk about artivism, I think we can understand it as almost any form of activism that's not your standard petition, march, typical NVDA, nonviolent direct action of so it's anything that sort of steps even slightly outside the bounds of activism as usual. And as we're finding ourselves in a situation where we are definitely confronting an abnormal situation, we need to also be thinking about how can we be confronting sort of activism as usual and trying to offer some more alternatives to that. So thus, demand the impossible. I'm going to start with 3 graphs. I promise this is not a science lecture, and I'm going to try to make this, and there's only 3, and then we're going to jump into the context. But I thought it would be a bit useful to actually just show some of this logic around demand the impossible at this special time when suddenly all these things that we were told for decades were impossible, suddenly things are happening very, very quickly. So as part of our context, this is the COVID graph going straight up. This is taken from yesterday, number of infections. This, likewise, a related graph is global extinction rates, also going exponentially up among almost all types of species, and this is way, way higher than the background level we see. The final graph of these is total annual CO2 emissions. So also we can see another graph going way up. Like, do you guys see a pattern? So I think what we need to remember is that as soon as we leave that steady state in these graphs, we are going into unprecedented territory. We're already existing in a constant state of abnormality, and thus much of the logic around the COVID discourse of returning to normal, we need to actually question what was that normal? Was that normal so great for everybody? And is that really where we want to go? Or can we actually go somewhere better? So thus, demand the impossible. Let's not just go back to where we were, but let's actually use our creative powers to be reimagining what this future can be. And then the last graph from 2 days ago, which puts a smile on my face, just to also show how nothing is what it seems, this is oil futures crashing into negative territory. So we are in a very particular moment in history when a lot of things that were taken as assumptions must now be questioned. So what is the role of artivism in all of this? This workshop and a lot of the work we do with the Artivist Network is focused on the idea of narrative intervention. How can art be used as a tool to intervene, change, hack, subvertise some of the dominant narratives that make up the world? So art is a tool. Let's remember that it can be used and that the world is made of stories. So to change the world, we must change the stories that govern this world. I think this frame is what I'm trying to communicate today, is this idea of understanding the narratives. If we can start to look at what are the narratives behind the actions we're actually seeing, behind the way other people are spinning stories, we might be better positioned to actually introduce new narratives that can open up new political space. And I think art, creativity, and culture have a long history of opening up space for new ideas that then politics can move into. And a quote that I find incredibly inspiring is by Bertolt Brecht, and I apologize that you guys have to see these little things in the whole time, is that art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it. So this is part of the governing logic of our work, is that art is not a way to be commenting on reality, but actually art is a tool in which we're interfering with reality. So as we're in such exceptional times, let's also think about how we are rethinking activism as usual. So here's kind of a nice example of activism as usual. And I come from many years in the global climate justice movement. So almost all the examples you'll be seeing are from that movement. And let's make this sidebar do its thing. Okay. Here's what the media, the politics like to think of as good activism. This is a vase, sort of, it's mostly men, handing over a petition to Ban Ki-moon, who is head of the UN, this guy. Al Gore is very excited about this all, and so is the mayor of New York. And this is, seen as good activism because it's reaffirming the power of those who have power. It's asking something and sort of asking quite politely. And this is a very useful tactic in a lot of situations. But we need to be thinking about how we can be engaging also in activism that questions some of these power structures in ways that create empowering spaces for people to be demanding change, not just asking for it. And I have to adjust this again, sorry. And here's an example of sort of some of the typical sort of like bad activism, people smashing stuff. The media loves to talk about this because it's much easier to talk about the tactic they're using than actually what they're talking about. It's a very simple message for media. And I think this is a really important message. What we're doing is to be looking for ways in which the tactics we are using are coherent with the message we're conveying. That way, it's much harder for someone else to change what we're trying to say, to focus on one aspect of a story instead of allowing us to tell the story we want to tell. So part of this question is, so between good activism and sort of bad activism, without judgments, what is the other space that creativity can play in opening up new spaces for activism? So here is an action we did here in Barcelona, where it was after general strike and all these, RoboCops decided it was time for everyone to go home, and they were starting to advance on a totally peaceful group of people in Plaza Catalunya. So what the police are expecting in the narrative that they have, and the action logic they have, is they expect when they go, put down their masks and go ahead, is that people either run away screaming, "Aye!" or they say, "Okay, this is it, like, we're ready, mask up and link arms and let's like brace for impact." What they are not expecting is people to throw a giant inflatable silver cube at them. So when they were suddenly confronted by something that came out of the logic of how they thought they were supposed to be reacting, they didn't know what to do. So they're cops, so what do? They hit it. So they hit the cube and it bounced back to the people. And then we hit it back to the cops, and then they hit it back to us. And then suddenly both sides actually realized we were playing a game. And the cops thought, this is not okay. We cannot be playing with these hooligans. So then they started just beating the cube, and they looked even more ridiculous because they were hitting this shiny object. So finally they got it subdued. They won, they arrested it. They did arrest the cube, not us. And then they went back to their line and like held their ground as angry cops. So I like to start with this example because it breaks a number of the logics of activism. It's sort of in this space between illegal and legal. It's sort of the illegal space. Where are there not necessarily clear boundaries or laws around this? It broke the narrative that both sides, both activists and police, had around how we should be acting. And it successfully stopped a police charge with no violence and just a little bit of insulation, which you can probably get at a hardware store, and a leaf blower to inflate it. So this is part of the logic of change the story. When we think about narrative intervention, let's change the story. Don't be a stick in the river, be the river. Don't be constantly reacting to a story that someone else is controlling. We actually need to be creating our own stories, because that is where we have control of what we're saying, and that is where we can actually bring in the message. So one example I love is, you're not stuck in traffic, you are traffic. I saw this for the first time spray painted under a bridge in London. And I think it's this nice example of how, by changing the position, by changing the point of view, you are actually describing the exact same situation in quite a different way. And with the global environmental and climate movement, we've done this quite a bit. You know, one of the dominant sort of narratives is save the earth. You know, okay, oh, are you okay? You know, don't be a fool, walk to school, recycle, energy bulbs and stuff. And you know, and so we always want to think, who's the protagonist here? Who has action? Who's empowered here? And it's save the earth. So it's who's doing the saving? It's us humans. We're coming out and we're saving the earth because it's suffering and we need help. And we love to save stuff as a climate movement. We have to save the climate, save the Arctic, save the world, save the polar bears, save the trees, save the planet. But this is, you know, putting the narrative focus on who's doing the saving and victimizing the planet itself. So we always want to be thinking about how we're constructing narratives. What are the power dynamics implicit in the narratives we're constructing? And how are those power dynamics either reinforcing dominant worldviews, which might be dangerous, or creating space for other stories to come into? So another way of approaching the same thing is this clever rabbit who says, the earth isn't dying, it's being killed. And those who are killing it have names and addresses. So sort of same issue, but suddenly changing the protagonism to, it's not dying, it's being killed. So suddenly you're bringing the public's view to the people that are causing the problem, instead of on the people that are going to fix the problem. And maybe that's a useful switch when we're trying to do stuff. Another way to flip that narrative too is save the humans. You know, here we are in 2009 in Copenhagen, dressed as a block of penguins, saying, hey, like, and again, this is taking out the humans from the center of the narrative and actually saying, hey, you're part of this bigger thing of all these other species. Let's join it together. And then one of the more recent examples from the Climate Games project, which launched in 2015 around the COP21 UN Climate Summit in Paris, was we are nature defending itself. So think about how the same issue, but jumping from save the earth to we are nature defending itself. Who's being empowered here? Who's sort of having protagonism? And and how does that set us up to be telling stories with that protagonist? And one example I want to mention, which are some of my heroes, which are the Pacific Climate Warriors. And this is a group of activists from all across the small islands all around the Pacific, who are perhaps some of the best activists in the world in actually changing the story they're in. So what these islanders, and these islands are many of the most vulnerable places on Earth to sea level rise and the impacts of climate change, and already populations are being displaced, and the future is a very serious subject for many of these people. And what they found is that they were constantly being the victim in the global narrative of we have to save Vanuatu, we have to save Kiribati. And they were like, hold on. We come from a warrior culture. We are descendants of the best navigators on the planet. We don't need you to save us. We need you to sort of back off and let us, fix this problem that you've created. So this, this very subtle, I mean, I love this banner. A single banner shows this narrative change. We are not drowning, we are fighting. And suddenly they've become the protagonists in their own story rather than the victims. And that really sets them up now to tell great stories. One of the things I want to talk about is an action that they did a number of years ago. And to structure this, I think also thinking about the structure of stories, we wanted to thinking about, look, with the global climate crisis, COVID, extinction, so many of the we're up against the richest corporations and industry and countries in the history of money that have huge amounts of power. It can be pretty intimidating, but think about the stories that we love the most, the stories you liked as a child. So many of these are about the unlikely hero doing something that didn't seem possible against all odds, aided by sort of a random mix of unlikely characters. Oh, my cat is interested in joining. So we're actually setting ourselves up to tell a really good story, sort of the David Goliath kind of thing. And here's an image from the Pacific Climate Warriors of how 30 climate warriors took on the biggest export coal port in the world. So they're setting that up of, there's just 30 of us, but we're taking on this huge thing. Let's do it. So it's setting up a really good story. And with some of the work they did, they decided to build traditional canoes. So across the different islands, people started organizing. Many places they went to the forest and asked the trees which trees wanted to participate in the action. And then as a mix of bringing, reinforcing traditional knowledge, intergenerational passing of knowledge, they started building traditional canoes. And they brought these to the world's largest coal export port in Australia. And for a whole day, they blockaded the port from any of these ships from entering and exiting. And it was an incredible action. And I think partially because it was such a good story. You can always think about actions as, is it a story you want to tell? Can you tell that story easily? If you can't tell the story of your action very easily, then maybe it's either not a good story or it's a bit too complicated and you need to simple down. Think about who are the different characters and what. And this was a great action that made news all over the world and really sort of showed the Pacific Climate Wars to be some of the real leaders for climate action and for climate activism around them. So along this idea of sort of be a story worth telling, create your own epic. We are in such crazy times. We've got the COVID crisis, the global climate crisis. As I said, we're sort of setting ourselves up to be quite an interesting story. So let's try to understand ourselves as part of this great turning that, 7 generations from now, they might look back and talk about what we did and how will they tell that story and what can we do now that is a story worth telling. So I just want to give a quick example of a project that I did. And it was sort of inspired by this thought of what if the environmental movement against hydraulic fracturing were to envision a national campaign to declare the groundwaters a common. I read this article by Jody Dean and found this very perplexing of what could that look like in activism? And this idea of reframing, instead of being anti-fracking, how could we be pro-water? So we actually created a project where we built a flotilla of paper mache canoes and for 3 weeks traveled down the Hudson River, which is surrounded by both trains and boats carrying fracked crude oil. And every day we would stop along the river and convene a conversation about water. And we actually found that we were able to reach, by focusing the frame on water instead of anti-fracking, we actually reached out to fisher people, boating clubs, a whole diversity of people that maybe wouldn't have gotten involved in anti-whatnot activism, but actually were very interested in, wanted to see these paper boats and whatnot. And we returned 2 years later on a solar-powered boat, talking about solutions projects along the river, and making the direct link. We had 3 Mohawk activists who are the indigenous people from New York with us, and they were telling stories from the Standing Rock occupation, a major indigenous anti-oil camp, that I think inspired a generation. And they were telling the story of Standing Rock by linking it directly to the oil infrastructure that was going past the people on the river. So trying to connect different parts of the story. Sometimes it's a question of where's that oil that goes by your town in a train? Where's that coming from? That builds a space of solidarity. And we used art, culture. This is JOC, a hip hop artist from Akwesasne, who was using culture to tell stories. We also were convening water ceremonies to try to encourage people to be developing a more direct connection with the water. When we think about how we're framing stories, also think about what is the relationship of the earth in the story that we're writing of the world, and how can we be inspiring more direct relationship with the earth, unmediated experiences. So I'm going to go through a few little tactics that might be useful when you're thinking, next time you're thinking, okay, we got to do something. We got to stop that bank because they're investing in this, or we need to stand up more for, this just happened. We have to do something. So a few different tactics and some examples of how it's been used, how different tactics have been used, so that we can see And one thing I do want to say is that, this is activism where it's all open source. So the idea is that you steal any ideas that are from here. And I'm trying to see this. And Amlin, perhaps if you, no, I think you're the admin. I don't know how to make just me show up on this little screen. Anyway, sorry. So some examples of objects that tell stories, and this text has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. So we're going to delete it now. This is a project that was done by a Swedish art collective, and it's called Run for Your Life. And they wanted to create a project that connected lots of people, again, who wouldn't necessarily be involved with activism. And what they ended up doing was creating a project where about 3,000 people passed a stone all the way from Sapmi, the indigenous territories in the north of Europe, all the way towards the Paris UN Climate Summit. And everyone would run 1 kilometer, and this was 24 hours a day, live streamed, and they would pass this stone around. And the stone came from a Sami poem. But this is a way that sort of by creating an object that got passed, they were actually creating this physical thing that could then connect pieces of a story. I think this is one thing we want to think a lot about. How, if we're building stories, how are we connecting to other stories? How are we building an intersectional narrative that shows how different struggles are connected? And this stone has taken on a whole life of its own. It's been traveling around the world since 2015, spent a number of years in the Pacific, and I think is now in Greenland. So a great example of how this object that was sort of created, suddenly a story can then go off on its own. And maybe that's a good way of a story, is if it runs away with itself, then it's a successful story. Use objects that tell stories. This is the White Bikes project that in a number of cities is used to mark places where bicyclists have been killed by cars. Using objects to keep alive memories and make visible things that aren't necessarily visible. This is a project by ANV COP 21, a French collective, that when all the banks in France started getting these massive public bailouts, they said, cool, well, if this is public, then we're going to go take the part of it because it's public. We'll use it for public use. So they, throughout months and months, went into banks and each time would steal a chair. And then they actually used these chairs to have a whole people's assembly and talk about how they need to be restructuring the financial system. But the chairs sort of became a symbol for that, that seat that the public should be occupying. Here is a project that in the pathway of the Keystone XL pipeline, major oil pipeline in the United States. These are indigenous communities planting traditional seed varieties on the proposed pathline. So setting up this story that if you build your pipeline, you're going to have to cut through all of these solutions. Another project built a solar barn on the pipeline route to kind of set up this thing where if you do this, then you have to do this. And here is another example of objects that tell stories. This is the forest occupation in Germany, Hambacher Forest. And when they give tours, they end up giving a seedling to the people that come and visit the forest. And it's, you know, they are protecting this forest from the expansion of the mine, but by that gift, they're focusing the story on the trees, on protecting the trees, rather than on confronting the mine. So ways in which we can be moving the perspective. And there's a little exercise that you can do even at home, is I'd invite everyone to sort of make a little kind of, a frame out of rectangle and look through it. So you can either see your computer screen, or you can see the ceiling, or you can see your cat, or you can see some books. But this is a good example of framing, because the world around us is the story. We can bring the frame to anything we want, to different areas. So always be, as we're constructing activism, think about who are we shining the light on? Who or what do we want to be drawing people's attention to? And what's the story behind that? And then just a few more objects that tell stories, again, from the Pacific Climate Warriors. Well, after they did their amazing canoe blockade, they realized that actually connected with the outside world, but it wasn't really but they sort of went home and their grandmothers was like, but why'd you go all the way over there and do all that dangerous stuff? So they thought, well, you know, we actually wanted to do something. They wanted to do something that connected with their own community. So they started weaving traditional mats, and again, involved the process of making things, which is a great idea of really think about art as an organizing tool, how we can be creating these elaborate things, because then we're going to spend hours sitting together talking. And as they convened people to make these traditional mats, they shared stories of climate impacts. And then a group brought these mats to the Vatican, a place of great significance for many of the people and their community. And they actually succeeded. This is, here you can see Sylvester. They actually succeeded in giving one of these mats to the Pope. And then, so then when they went home, then their grandmother was like, oh, the Pope has a mat that Sylvester's grandmother made. So suddenly they were actually able to connect to their own community in a new way that they hadn't been before, even when they had been able to sort of make headlines around the world. So always thinking, who's the audience that you're trying to reach and trying to communicate to, because who the audience is will definitely affect what you're doing. Just a few more examples of objects that tell stories, I think is a fantastic tool, and often can kind of give body to an idea. This is another project of red dresses to draw attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And sort of by having the dresses hanging there, you know, it immediately conjures, well, where's the person who should be in that? An object that we're used to seeing in one way, used in another. And then just two examples, quite easy things. If you don't know how to use an object to tell a story, make it really big. Here's an inflatable carbon bubble to draw attention to the carbon bubble. This 80% of fossil fuels in the global economy will need to be left underground and thus are worthless. It's a huge economic bubble. People weren't talking about it enough, so we made a giant one, and fortunately, the police ended up popping it on the horns of the bull, which is the symbol of growth. So they were quite useful in helping us sort of enact that metaphor. And then here's a pipeline we were fighting for years. Successfully, we stopped it here in Catalonia, and we just made a big inflatable pipeline because no one knew about it. So we said, people need to know about it, let's make it big. So using objects to tell stories. And then often we don't have to sort of tell our own stories because our adversaries, corporations love, you know, their whole brand image is about telling the story of, we are a compassionate oil company that really wants to make sure you're not cold in winter and that your pancakes sort of always come out perfect, or, you know, whatever they do. And they construct whole stories already. So, you know, BP, Beyond, did this whole logo revamp, and then Greenpeace very cleverly had a whole hacking their logo campaign. So when they launched their new logo, Greenpeace also launched all these other versions. This was after the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. But corporations put so much money and energy into their brand, to protecting their brand, so that, you know, when you glance at something, you've got like, oh yeah, these are nice people, you know, like blah blah. You can see they like, it's all like greens, earth tones, blah blah blah, kind of flowery. So sometimes just adding another layer to that story. So if they've got a story constructed, sometimes you can be like, oh yeah, yeah, it's all flowery until you spill oil all over it. So just adding another layer means they've already built the story, and it's just up to us to add a little twist, a critique, sort of hacker culture. Take their thing and just give it a dook, and then it goes in a totally different direction. Here's an example from the Netherlands, a group called Fossil Free Culture, who do amazing work. And they were targeting the Van Gogh Museum because of its sponsorship by Shell. And they were saying, look, this is a public institution. Art and culture should have nothing to do with the fossil fuels that are destroying our world. So every time the museum had a special exhibit, here it is, On the Verge of Insanity, Van Gogh and his illness, they would do sort of a thematic direct action, creative direct action in the museum. So here's someone, in this particular action, they were all wearing sort of the white gowns typical of sort of imagined mental institutions, and they were actually sort of spilling oil out of their mouths and wandering around talking to themselves, acting a bit crazy, and trying to draw attention to how crazy it is to be burning fossil fuels when we're in the middle of a global climate crisis. And here's another action I wanted to mention by the same group, Fossil Free Culture. And they've taken as their symbol a shell, because they're targeting Shell, and Shell is sort of a natural image. But I wanted to show this image because it's useful to reflect how much this image, this action, breaks the dominant logic or the mainstream logic of what direct action should be. It's normally people in the sort of bad activism thing, it's people wearing black with their masks, with their faces covered, you know, ready for confrontation. Here we see a group of all women, all wearing white, all barefoot, sort of really showing vulnerability. And that's an interesting power we have, is showing vulnerability, because so much of the culture of violence that state repression is linked to is about power and violence. So showing vulnerability sort of breaks that logic in itself. And yeah, so I think a great group that is constantly thinking about how to reinvent activism. So again, hack their stories. This is a subvertising project by a group called Brandalism from the UK that was also around the Paris COP21 climate summit. And they replaced hundreds of bus ads all around Paris with fake advertisements that looked real. So, you know, they've got sort of the Volkswagen logo. It's all the same font, the same aesthetic. All they're doing is changing the word. So adding another level. At a glance, you can tell this is Volkswagen. You understand it. And they're just saying, we're sorry that we got caught. This was after the Volkswagen emissions scandal. This doesn't just have to apply to corporations. This is an example from here in Spain. Here in Spain, the bull is sort of the symbol of powerful central Spain government, blah, blah, blah. And during the financial crisis around 2011, some very intelligent person just painted over part of this in sky blue. So you sort of see the kind of like spindly little goat thing at the middle of this powerful symbol. And it was a very relevant moment because, you know, it was like, Spain, I don't know if you're so strong right now. You got more than 50% youth unemployment. So an interesting way to comment on existing symbols and adding another layer to a story that they've already built. Sometimes, you know, let them do the work for us. Cool. And another sort of principle of creative creative activism that can be used a lot when we're thinking about narrative storytelling is make visible the invisible, shine light into the darkness. When we're thinking about framing, often think about what's the part of the frame that's not being told? What's the part of the story that's not, that isn't being told? And often that is where we need to be shining light, drawing attention, and listening to those people. Often that is the people most impacted by projects and structural forms of oppression. And if we can be creating space for them to be the protagonists of the story. Often activism, if you've got, like myself, enough privilege in any form, so much of activism is about trying to share that privilege and make sure that if you're from a population that is quite well represented in the dominant narrative, how can we be creating activism that can open up space for new voices that aren't being represented to come in? Here's a project about sort of making visible the invisible, done by an incredible collective here in Barcelona called Enmedio. The website's Enmedio, ENMEDIO.info. They have some amazing projects. Definitely check them out. And what they were doing is they were working with people, the people that were being evicted from their houses by banks, and they would go with the people to wheat paste their own portrait onto the bank that was evicting them. It was incredibly empowering for the people. They would do this as a large group, but it also suddenly created a moment where you see the logo of the bank that's evicting them. You have a little bit about their name, and you see the face. And as soon as you see the face of, suddenly you connect more with that. The bank is okay with saying there's 1,000 evictions a day, but they don't want you knowing the story. They don't want you to know about the kids that live in those houses. So often adding some of the details of who's being impacted and letting them speak up, creating space for their stories to be told. And here's another couple in front of a bank protesting their own eviction. And a group I'll mention quickly because we're sort of running out on time. But if you're in quarantine and you're like, hey, I want to watch a movie, check out any of the documentaries by the Yes Men. It is this amazing, really wild group of activists that have had huge success. And what they do is they do reality correction. For example, here's a fake newspaper they created. It looks exactly like the real New York Times, except all of the headlines are good. The Iraq War ends. This is from, I don't know, 2009. You know, people apologize, maximum wage law succeeds. So they tell the story of the world as it should be, not as it is. And yeah, just the Yes Men. They have lots of really great documentaries. And the Yes Labs, a project that they actually work with groups to be creating their own projects. And one quick project okay, you can't see me anymore, but that's okay. This was from Copenhagen and the UN Climate Summit in 2009. And there was sort of this stalemate where nothing was advancing. And then finally, the delegate from Canada and the delegate from Uganda reached an important bilateral agreement. And that sort of, broke through major news into the news of, okay, finally something good has happened. And it was actually all a stunt. It was in this little makeshift office they had made in the basement of an art studio. These are two of the Yes Men. And they had built the studio literally on beer crates. So you don't always need a lot of money. But by launching this fake announcement, suddenly they created a situation where Canada then had to either respond saying, no, we don't take historic responsibility for our emissions. We're still not going to do anything about climate. Or they had to say, oh yeah, okay, yeah, we'll do that. So they sort of, by opening this narrative gap between what is and what should be, it begs the question of why is it not like that? So sometimes opening that gap up is good, but definitely check them out before you try to do this the tactic, because it's fine line between reality correction and lying. So definitely think it through properly. Cool. And then cool. A bit harder to see, but this idea of use symbols that tell stories as we think also about images that can communicate stuff. So much symbols are already created, as we saw with corporations, but also often if you can jump on the right moment, you can create a symbol that tells a story that's already happening, but there isn't words for, or there isn't a place for it. And just an example, this is a piece of graffiti by the world famous artist Banksy, who's very clever. And I think so clever because they're really good at telling two stories at once, opening up this narrative gap between what is and what could be. And here, with a bit of simple intervention, you can see both what is this? It's a parking lot, and what could it be? A park. So thinking about how we open up that space. And now with symbols that tell stories, one example I wanted to share was, I didn't put the slide in, is from the Gezi Park insurrection in Istanbul a number of years ago. And while media news outlets all over the world were streaming live from the massive protests happening in the center of Istanbul, CNN Turkey was screening a documentary about penguins. So immediately the penguin became a symbol for the media's not talking about what's going on. And it was amazing, like suddenly like penguins were graffitied everywhere, people were dressed as penguins, like the street vendors started selling penguin t-shirts. But it really jumped on this moment of creating a symbol around something that everyone was feeling, everyone knew it was happening, and how useful that was. Another tactic that we should be thinking about when we're approaching creative activism is, again, this flattening the curve while reducing emissions has nothing to do with this. It was just the base slide I was using. Places that tell stories. So think about what, if we're telling a story, where's the scene? Where's the story taking place? That's really important. What's the stage that we're using? And one action, that the first action by the group Liberate Tate, another fantastic collective from the UK that have also been using culture to protest the investment in of fossil fuel infrastructure in public cultural institutions. And then this action, which cost them £17 to buy the little gas things and some fake oil. Why is this action so powerful? One, because look where it is. In the background here, there is that typical nude sculpture of a museum. It's this wide open space, and they're really breaking the logic of a space. You can always think, what is the logic of a space and how can we break that logic? In museums, you don't make a mess, you don't show up naked. And then this action, to draw attention to BP's sponsorship of the Tate Museum, this action was hugely successful, got onto the Evening News, into the Financial Times, and really highlighted for the first time some of these issues of why are these groups being sponsored. And just to visit some of the actions we've already seen in closing, as we think about sort of the scene, the theater in which our action takes place. It can be sort of by putting yourself in the root of something bad that will happen. It can be going to a place of huge significance to your community. It can be actually engaging with the natural element you're trying to talk about. If you're talking about forest destruction, maybe go to a forest. If you're talking about water pollution, maybe do something, think about engaging directly with water. And then another example of sort of, the place, the theater here, this is a great image. And this is also by Liberate Tate. And here is people actually tattooing the parts per million of CO2 from the year they were born onto their bodies. And actually doing this in the museum, you can see the backdrop of the big painting in the middle, the smaller ones on the sides. It really creates a great image. So always thinking, what is the image that can also tell the story of this? And in these times of quarantine, someone on this call I know is involved with this. Where's the site of protest? Maybe it's in Second Life, this like internet parallel world space. Here is an anti-planes action that happened 2 weeks ago in this digital fantasy world. But still quite a number of people sitting down on a runway and blocking airplanes, saying "Save people, not planes." In closing, just remember that art is a tool, but it's also an organizing tool. Really think not just about how arts organizing can be about creating a product, but actually how can the process of coming up with the action, creating it, making the costumes, painting the banner, you know, the journey itself, the action, taking the risk together, how can actually the action be constructed itself as an organizing tool? Think about the Pacific Climate Warriors spending hours weaving these mats together. What I've seen from my experience is it's a great way to get new people involved with movements. It feels inspiring. You're doing stuff with your hands, which feels great. And so maybe after a few meetings where it feels like nothing's going, maybe sometimes you want to jump in, bring some of the body into that work. And here's a part of our art collective here in Barcelona, working with some of the Fridays for Future youth to paint the banner. And then here's that same banner in action that, you know, got in headlines of papers all across Catalonia, and was a really inspiring moment and way to build new connections. As we head out into this very strange, rapidly changing world where 2 days ago, oil futures were negative valued, and I've been home for 6 weeks and can't go outside. Expect the unexpected. We are in destabilized times. The collapse will be anything but boring. So we are going to need huge amounts of creativity, imagination, so that we can all be not only confronting the narrative of the story of the world as it is, but showing that we have much better ideas about how the world can be, and how to get there. And to close, here's an image I just want to share because it was also just an example of how activism can create transformative moments for people. This was also in the Istanbul Gezi Park uprising. And it was a really tense moment because the park that had been occupied to protect it from destruction was in danger of being evicted. The police had gotten closer and closer over the barricades. And it was announced that that night there was going to be a mass eviction of the park. Well, that night, this guy wheeled this grand piano into the plaza between the park and the police lines and started playing classical music. And he sat there all night playing classical music. And hundreds of us were sitting around for hours listening to the music. It was an incredibly transformative experience and a great example of how beauty can make violence impossible. The police couldn't attack us because you can't attack 500 people sitting down listening to Beethoven. It just looks really, really bad. So think about when we're talking about art as a tool, let's not abandon completely the aesthetics and the role that beauty can have in creating transformational experiences for people. So while we're sitting at home, this is a photo I took just down the street from here. We're not in quarantine, we're organizing. So let's really be thinking about how we can be using this time as a look inside, build new skills, participate in our webinars. We've got a few more coming up. So that we come out more inspired than ever to make sure we don't return to normal, but actually we go forward. So thank you very much. We're the artivistnetwork.org. Please, follow us on Instagram and Facebook, or if you filled out the sign-in sheet, and I think we've got your email. But definitely let's stay in touch. Would love to hear more about how we can collaborate, and we're just at the start of trying to build what's really a global network of arts activists that can continue to exchange ideas like this, so we can copy each other, collaborate, have 10 things happening all around the world. And to show really the useful power of creativity. So thank you very much. You've been a great audience. Thanks to everyone on the front row here who sort of unexpectedly had to be watching yourselves on the screen. And thanks to everyone. Back to you, Emily.
All right, thank you very much, Kevin. That was a lot of information. All right, now we have a short Q&A session. If anyone has any questions or anything they would like to say, please feel free to unmute yourselves and just ask your question directly. And also, before you ask your question, just quickly just say who you are again, just so we know. Thank you.
Leah, I'd just like to say that's blown my mind. That's incredibly amazing, and thank you so much.
like you have another fan, Kevin. Yeah, anyone else with any questions or anything they would like to say? Yeah, go ahead, Marion.
Okay, not a question, just that was just incredible. And I think as we come out of this time, which is so strange, I love the idea of the fake news, because we're going to make that story ready to go so that it's already out there. You know, this is the new, that, you know, that idea of the newspaper or something of that kind. I think it's wonderful. So many great ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Just one thing, wanted to share a little bit about like the fake news thing, because we had the chance to speak to the Yes Men directly and everything, and they were amazing people. It is a really amazing tactic, especially to use in times like these. However, with things that are going on with the pandemic, like a lot of countries, for example, like Malaysia, where I'm from, anything with fake news would literally end you up in jail, because of like they're trying to keep information, like fake information about COVID to prevent like chaos in the public. But at the same time, these kind of tactics, there are so many ways we can use them and so many different styles. Like the interview way was one way. One thing I found really amazing, because when you see that video, because there's an actual video of this interview with this Canadian and if I'm not mistaken, Ugandan delegate, and they just turned out to be fakes. It literally was made in like this like basement of an art studio, and it was just hilarious to see the whole process behind it. So yeah, sometimes fake news can be used not just with like articles or websites, but even just like videos and stuff.
I was wondering about the use of logos, whether that, I mean, obviously companies could jump on that. That have people ever run into that kind of issue of getting hauled up, you know, this our logo? Or do you make it just a little bit different, or how?
Well, yeah, I can respond to that. I think from my experience and what I've heard from other people is that both with sort of the reality correction, subvertising, vandalism stuff, and sort of the, you know, logo hacking stuff, often what will happen is the company will sort of send a letter saying you can't do that anymore, but actually the last thing they want is more public attention on this. So sort of the best thing for you to get your logo in all of the newspapers is that then they take you to court and it becomes this big thing. So they often tend to drop it. The Yes Men, who have done tons of fake websites, they've sort of impersonated people all over the world pretending to be CEOs. They've actually never had a lawsuit brought against them, because they say, great, I think this is an example of how they created a narrative frame that then, you know, then the corporations are playing on their field. You know, they've created the river, and then the corporations are a stick in their river. So if you can create sort of the battleground, then it's much easier to be engaging with the opponent there than always having to go into their narrative territory.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the question.
So I would like to ask a question too. Thank you also from my side for this presentation. It was very, very interesting. And I'm questioning, so I'm engaged in Extinction Rebellion, and so the idea is to block the normal, so to block normality. And I find this very hard to tell the story, because on the one hand, you want to be very and want to say, tell the people, hey, we are dreaming of a better future and we could do this together. But on the same at the same moment, you are blocking their lives. And do you have any idea how a blockade could be to be really telling everyone the story that you are the group of people which is trying to achieve a better future?
Thank you, Jasper. That's a great question. And I think that's really the angle line, the right place to be pushing right now. And yeah, I think, as you said, it's a very delicate space to make sure you're not pissing more people off than making new comrades. I think just from what I'm seeing here in Spain, a lot of that will depend on what happens now. How are we setting up the narrative so that there's this clear sense that you know, there's this swindles happened, that they've like this crisis has been used to further the problems that were already existent rather than resolve them, and then maybe a bit of that narrative space around that of how you know, how instead of making problems worse, for example, bailing out airlines and cruise ships, fueling another crisis while dealing with this one, we actually can be holistically addressing these and think about certain specific points of where the narrative is building lots of solidarity. Here in Spain, it's definitely around health, public health care, and air quality. Everyone here is noticing how nice it is to breathe all of a sudden. So we've been thinking a bit about that, of actually how is now an opportune moment to actually take on cars and traffic with this idea that we need to be protecting public health. That means public air quality. We can't let all these cars back into the city now that we've seen how nice it could be. And one of the projects that, as the Artivist Network, we're doing is a fiction project, actually to try to use this time to actually help people imagine and articulate what these better worlds could look like. Often it's, and I think this is one of the reasons why I really like working with artists and anyone who is creative, which I think we all are, is this experience in creating things that don't yet exist. Anyone who's made a painting knows you have to sort of have an idea before you start. And I think that's sort of the same situation we are in with social change, is we need to be showing people that there's a vision that we're moving to before we can actually move there. So art and culture is a way to open up imaginations that political space can move into it. But definitely share your great ideas once you've got them, because it's an important space to be organizing around now. But yeah, I think definitely make sure the organizing starts now and not the action is the final step, not the first step.
Hello, yes, I would have a question. Yes, I am Carlos from Budapest, and I would like to ask, have you seen a rise of arts activism in the movement in the last years, and has it helped the certain movements gain more visibility on social media?
Cool, thank you, Carlos. Yeah, I think we have seen, I think especially as the way in which people are communicating is becoming increasingly decentralized. We're less dependent on the newspapers and TV news to tell our stories. We're increasingly able to tell our own stories ourselves. I think more and more people are actually using creativity, acknowledging that now we're such a visual culture. We're sharing images and videos as ways of telling stories. So I think we've actually seen a huge jump in the understanding of the importance of activism and creative activism, and sort of reinventing activism as normal. And one hope we actually have as the Artivist Network is to actually be trying to think about how some of our platforms can actually be spaces where we're exchanging directly among different creative actors around the world. So many people on this call from so many different places, that whenever we're doing something in South Africa, we can be sharing it with others, and then maybe we copy it in Budapest and copy it in Japan, so that we don't always have to be reinventing things ourselves. But yeah, and definitely it's always good to think through the action around what is the image that tells this story, and always how are you constructing images so that you can make sure that your frame is being maintained, your story is being told. Thanks for the question, Carlos.
Thank you.
And I've just, so you've got them all in one place. I've just put a short list of some of the different groups I mentioned in the call today, if you want to check them out a bit further, into the chat. And yeah, I think we'll definitely get this video up online onto the website as well, so that people can share it, you can consult it, and come back to it, and possibly the presentation as well. We can manage that.
All right. Are there any more questions from anybody? Or anything anyone would like to say? All right, not really. So, oh yeah, Dion McDonald.
Okay. You know, you said you're doing like a online storytelling. Is that the future? That's like written word, or are people using images and words as well? And what about collaboration with visual artists if it is just words illustrating the words that some people are writing?
Great question, and definitely send us a message, because this is exactly what we're talking about. Is right now we've launched a few different projects. One is the Coloring Book of Collapse, a visual project, and the other is sort of these stories of the future of what May Day 2021 could look like. And we're really actually hoping that with the different projects, those sort of synergies come, that someone writes a short story and that inspires a poster, or someone creates an image that can inspire a story. But the future story is imagined as sort of short pieces of fiction, and the coloring book as visuals. But we really do hope that that cross-pollination can happen. So definitely get in touch with us. Yeah, and I'll put my I'll put my email into the chat here in case anyone wants to follow up with questions or to find out how to get more involved with the network.
Also, if you'd like to contact the Artivist Network, you can also just visit our website, and all our social media links, our contact information, all of that is on the website as well.
Cool. Well, and thank you all so much. This has been really inspiring, and the best thing I could think of to try to contribute to this. So really, really great to have everyone so enthusiastic and inspiring, and definitely stay in touch. We're just starting the network up, but there's unlimited potential. Creativity is an unlimited resource.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on our first webinar. If you would like to find out more information about everything that we are doing, please visit our website, artivistnetwork.org, and you can find all future information there. And if you've not signed on to our newsletter and future webinars, the link is in the chat. Do sign on, and we will notify you whenever we have any activities or projects that are coming your way. And yes, thank you very much to the Gastivist Collective for letting us use their Zoom channel. They are an amazing collective against gas in Europe, mostly. And yeah, with that, I guess, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. You'll find this video up on our website and our social media soon. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.